failed to honor its obligations, including the protection of religious and ethnic minorities, we reserve the right to reimpose crippling sanctions, end of quote. In addition, our bill ensures that there are presidential waivers to provide flexibility for the administration on how almost all the sanctions are administered. This bill incentivizes Turkey to comply with the ceasefire. If they do not, there will be consequences in the form of crippling sanctions. Turkey is also a vital NATO partner, and I'm hopeful they will cease their destabilizing actions and act as a responsible partner. With that in mind, let's recap how we got here today. On October 9th, Erdogan's forces charged across the border, unleashing a potential humanitarian crisis for the people in northern Syria. The assault has expanded Assad and Putin's grip on Syrian territory. And as I said 2 weeks ago, I am concerned that this incursion will damage U.S. interests in the Middle East and the Syrian people, including the Kurds, our ally. The only beneficiaries of more violence and more chaos in Syria are America's adversaries, and that is Vladimir Putin, Bashar al-Assad, Iran, and terror groups like ISIS. On October 17th, the administration brokered a ceasefire with Turkey, which has held to date. This has helped to stabilize the situation and prevented a worst-case scenario from taking place. I applaud the Vice President and Secretary Pompeo for that delicate negotiation with President Erdogan and believe that our bipartisan resolution, which disapproved the Turkish incursion last week, I believe helped in these negotiations. Our bill today, and my bill with Mr. Engel, codifies the administration's agreement in Ankara and will help to strengthen the President's hand in ensuring that Turkey upholds its commitments. Our bill imposes penalties on Turkey if it continues its offensive in northern Syria. Specifically, it sanctions Turkish officials involved in military operation in Syria. It blocks U.S. weapons sales to Turkey that could be used in Syria and sanctions foreign entities selling such weapons to Turkey. And it sanctions banks supporting Turkey's defense sector in the Syria campaign. Our bill also requires the administration to develop plans to adjust our counterterrorism strategy to respond to the changing situation on the ground. And I'm pleased that the administration heard our call for a residual force in Syria. I can think of nothing more dangerous than withdrawing all of our troops from Syria. As we saw when we withdrew under the previous administration from Iraq, the 10,000 forces, that's when we saw the rise of ISIS and the so-called caliphate. We will have a residual force in Syria working with the SDF and the Kurds to help defeat and make sure ISIS is never again a threat to the homeland. Finally, it identifies Turkey's purchase of the Russian S-400 system as a transaction subject to sanctions under the Counting America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or CATSA. That's very important. How can you be a NATO ally and purchase Russian military equipment? We let Turkey into NATO to protect them from the Soviet Union, and now our NATO ally is buying Russian equipment, Russian military equipment, and through its invasion into Syria, threatening our allies. For these reasons, I urge support of this bill, and once again, I want to thank Chairman Engel for once again coming to a bipartisan resolution when once again they said it couldn't be done. Mr. Chairman, we got it done, and I thank you for that, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
I thank the ranking member for his kind words, and I now yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
To address the House. I again rise with appreciation for the chairman of this committee and the ranking member of this committee and echo the importance of this bipartisan resolution. I'd like us to go down memory lane for those of us who've had the privilege of being here, Mr. Engel. We're reminded of a secular Turkey, a Turkey where all were welcomed. We remember visiting some of the beautiful and wonderful treasures of Turkey as we met with government officials and heard them reinforce their commitment to democracy, to the idea of freedom of religion. And that is appropriate for a 70-year member of NATO. We're very grateful for their commitment to NATO. There are many who continue to advocate for Turkey's presence in NATO so that NATO could be comprehensive and unique. But we find ourselves now in the grips of a single-minded individual who does not see the beauty of democracy, does not see the beauty of diversity and the welcoming of those from many places to Turkey, or the orderly process and the strong role they can play in the Mideast. Yet, on a midnight call or a late night call on a Sunday night, speaking to this administration, the Turkish president didn't consult or maybe offer options, but what we have gleaned from the media is that they said, we are coming into Syria. And in the midst of them coming into Syria, they created a humanitarian crisis, fleeing women and children, destroying homes, taking people away from their homeland, and just doing havoc. There must be order in the world and respect and dignity and a respect for the sanctity of life. I am glad to rise for this, in support of this legislation. To target Turkey for sanctions will not be lifted until Turkey withdraws from northern Syria. And the bill requires concrete strategies from the administration from combating ISIS, protecting Syrian Kurdish communities, and an analysis of human rights violations committed by Turkish forces, as well as a refugee program. It goes with my earlier designation that this is a humanitarian crisis. It responds to the needs of the people. This is not an act of war. This is to seek peace. This bill freezes assets and imposes a mandatory visa ban against senior officials of Turkey, including the Minister of National Defense, who apparently would not listen. Additionally, the PAC Act prohibits all arms transfer that Turkey could use in Syria. Bloodshed against the people, not peace. Finally, the PACT Act imposed targeted sanctions on Halkbank, a Turkish bank with ties to President Erdogan. We'd have wished to be around the diplomatic table to resolve the issues in Syria. We might have been on the verge of doing that. There was a calmness on the border, the northern border. We had a certain number of troops. Great opportunities remained before Turkey. But unwise and unilateral decisions were made. Part of that was the withdrawing of our armed forces from northern Syria. But I think it is clear to those of us who do want peace that there was a way of doing it. These sanctions should send a very strong message to Syria that we are,
the gentlelady's time has expired.
Recognizing the Kurds.
I yield an additional 30 seconds to the gentlewoman.
The gentlelady is recognized for additional 30 seconds.
I thank the gentleman. A strong message to Syria that, one, we in the United States Congress take seriously the intrusion of Turkey into the Kurdish area. It should send a strong message to President Erdogan to recognize that he cannot bully his way through in the region. It should also send a strong message to Iran and Russia and to our ISIS foes that America is serious about peace, but doing it in a manner that provides as safe a pathway for peace as possible. I would hope and would have wanted the decision that the President made on a phone call never to have occurred. It did occur. Unfortunately, President Erdogan was a partner in this, and we must make a very strong statement that the United States will not stand for this kind of bullying and that we will ensure that we will find peace, but in the right way. With that, I support H.R. 4695, and I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bill Rackus.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Congratulations again, Mr. Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall for this very important Turkey sanctions bill. You know, Mr. Speaker, for nearly 13 years, I've felt like I've been one of the lone voices in the wilderness decrying the actions of Turkey as it systematically denies its citizens basic human rights by invading and occupying an EU country, the Republic of Cyprus, stripping religious minorities of their religious freedom, persecuting journalists and academics for writing about the Armenian Genocide, invading and provoking hostilities on a daily basis in the Eastern Mediterranean. As co-chair of the International Religious Freedom Caucus, I'm especially grateful for this PACT Act, calling for the administration to outline how it will assist religious and ethnic minorities affected by war crimes perpetrated by Prime Minister Erdogan. Additionally, in my role as co-chair of the Hellenic Caucus, I've called for the administration to halt the delivery of F-35s to Turkey, giving its purchase of Russia's S-400 missile defense system. I am pleased this bill goes further and imposes 231 sanctions for Turkey's intransigence. I urge support of this legislation so that we can send a unified, bipartisan message to Turkey that if you want to become considered a strategic ally of the United States, a true ally, you have to act like one. And I want to, again, thank the chairman and the ranking member and the entire Foreign Affairs Committee for bringing up this very important bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Florida yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hurd.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend from Texas for yielding. And I'm proud to rise today in support of the bipartisan PACT Act to hold Turkey accountable for its destabilizing and dangerous decision to invade northern Syria and attack America's Kurdish allies. After years of fighting side by side with American forces against ISIS, Syrian Kurds are now being under siege and fleeing their homes. According to the United Nations, over 180,000 people have been displaced, including 80,000 children. Many are fleeing to the Kurdish region of Iraq, which already hosts over 200,000 refugees from the Syrian civil war. Turkey's reckless actions have created a humanitarian crisis that will strain our partners in the region and provide ISIS with an opportunity to reemerge as a threat to the United States. The international community must come together to provide assistance to Kurds and refugees in both Syria and Iraq. The U.S. Special Envoy for Syria also told Congress last week that there have been several incidents of potential war crimes committed by Turkey or its proxies, including the use of white phosphorus, which can be used as a chemical weapon on civilians in extrajudicial killings. We cannot stand idly by while Turkey undermines the fight against ISIS, attacks our Kurdish allies, and puts hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in harm's way. These sanctions are an appropriate response that holds Turkey responsible for its actions and provides incentives for President Erdogan to change course. One thing I learned during my time as an undercover officer in the CIA is that America only succeeds when our enemies fear us and our allies trust us. As members of NATO, both the U.S. and Turkey have committed to unite their efforts for collective defense and for preservation of peace and security. I hope our Turkish counterparts will recommit to these principles and work with us to address shared security concerns and protect the successes of joint U.S.-Kurdish efforts to drive ISIS out of Syria. Thank you to my friends, the gentleman from New York and the gentleman from Texas, for their work and their commitment on this important bipartisan bill. I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Kinzinger.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Well, thank you, and I thank the ranking member for yielding. It's sad that we're here. As a military member, I spent a number of times in Incirlik Air Base in Turkey in '06, or maybe a little before '05, and I think we all as members of this body have probably been there in our travels, and we see some amazing potential for a country that really straddles 2 continents and plays such an important role in the future. But it's sad to see what's happened. And so I'm reluctantly having to rise today in support of H.R. 4695, the Protect Against Conflict of Turkey Act, also known as the PAC Act. I co-sponsored this because I'm worried about the direction of President Erdogan and the direction he's taking the Republic of Turkey. The leader of a country with so much to offer the world should not be cozying up to the likes of Vladimir Putin and Bashar al-Assad. Vladimir Putin, who oversees a failing nation, quite honestly, and is not the future. And yet that's exactly what Erdogan's doing when he decided to invade Syria. Far too many men, women, and children have died at the hands of Assad, Putin, and Khomeini. And it's unthinkable that a leader of a NATO nation will be joining this list of murderous thugs. But given the latest developments in Syria, many of our Kurdish partners will likely die because of Erdogan's offensive. These are the same Kurdish fighters who, while we lost less than 20 soldiers in the fight against ISIS from combat, lost over 10,000 of their own men and women. These are the same Kurdish fighters who spent the past 5 years hunting ISIS leader Abu al-Baghdadi alongside our men and women in uniform, and we saw that come to fruition in a great way this weekend. Without their constant pressure on the ISIS networks, our operators may have never had the chance to bring him to justice, not to mention the fact that Turkey inevitably threatened to attack our troops in northern Syria. And that's why I'm proud to co-sponsor this by applying targeted sanctions against those directly responsible for the operations. We're sending a message to the Erdogan government that the U.S. will hold them liable for their actions. If he does not want to act like a NATO nation, then his government will feel the repercussions of such decisions. I really want to thank Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall for their steadfast leadership of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I commend them for their ability to work in a bipartisan manner to advance measures in America's interest. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Illinois yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York.
It's now my pleasure to yield 1 minute to our Speaker of the House, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Pelosi.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him and Mr. Engel, the distinguished chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and the distinguished ranking member of the committee, Mr. McCall, for their leadership in bringing this important bipartisan leadership to the floor. Mr. Speaker, as we all know, 3 weeks ago, the President unleashed an escalation of chaos and insecurity in Syria when he gave Turkey the green light to attack our Kurdish partners, threatening lives, risking regional security, and undermining America's credibility as a trustworthy ally. And then, instead of holding Turkey accountable for its aggression, the President reversed his sanctions in exchange for a so-called ceasefire, which the Turks clearly stated was not a ceasefire. Today, Democrats and Republicans come together to demonstrate the strong, smart leadership that has sorely been lacking from the White House as the House passed this tough, targeted sanctions bill to hold the Turks accountable for their attacks on our Kurdish partners. We salute Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall, once again, for their leadership on this PACT, P-A-C-T, Act, and on the resolutions opposing President Trump's decision on Syria, including House Joint Resolution 77, a bipartisan bicameral resolution which passed the House on a 354 to 60 vote. Here are the facts. Our Kurdish partners freed millions of people and tens of thousands of square miles from the grip of ISIS. Throughout the fight, they sustained nearly 11,000 casualties. Until recently, our Kurdish partners protected America's security and the security of the region, as more than 10,000 ISIS fighters and tens of thousands of ISIS family members were under their control. Yet, in a matter of weeks, the President has put our progress at risk. Even with the death of al-Baghdadi, ISIS remains a serious and resurgent threat. The death of a top ISIS leader does not mean the death of ISIS. Scores of fighters remain under uncertain conditions in Syrian prisons and at risk of a jailbreak. Nearly 800 ISIS supporters and family members have reportedly escaped. To say that Turkey and Syria still adequately guard the prisoners is outrageous and dangerous. At the same time, more than 250,000 Kurdish civilians have fled their homes because of Turkish attacks. Dozens of civilians, in addition to possibly hundreds of brave Kurdish fighters, have been killed. The only winners from the President's disastrous decision in Syria are ISIS, the Syrian government, Iran, and Russia. With these targeted strong sanctions, America is holding accountable top Turkish officials responsible for human rights abuses, including attacking our Kurdish partners. We are penalizing Turkish financial institutions who perpetuate President Erdogan's corruption and abuses, and are preventing the sale of arms to Turkey for use in Syria. As the House passes this legislation, we again call upon the President to support the Kurdish communities and work to ensure that the Turkish military acts with restraint. And we require the Trump administration to finally present a clear strategy to defeat ISIS. I strongly urge I know we have bipartisan support for this legislation. Again, I salute Ranking Member McCall and Chairman Engel for bringing this legislation to the floor, which is a vote to support the sacrifice of our military and our allies, and a vote to restore strength, strategy, and sanity to our national security policy. I think that a very strong bipartisan vote in the House, similar to the one we had on House Joint Resolution 77, will send a very clear message that we can come together, and we will come together in the interest of our national security, in the interest of Americans' values, which are part of our strength, and again, to fight terrorism wherever it exists so that it does not reach our shores. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from California yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to echo Madam Speaker's comments. When we stand united on the floor of the Congress as Americans, that's when we send the strongest message overseas to adversaries. I want to thank Mr. Engel for his strong work in working with me to get to a positive place where we can actually get to a solution to what's been a challenging and very fluid situation. It's always an honor to work with you, sir, on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And in these times of crises, we are, I believe, strongest on the world stage when the executive and legislative branch speak in one voice. I know in his testimony before our committee, Ambassador Jeffries, a special envoy to Syria, said, "I saw firsthand the effect of congressional sanctions when we visited with the Turkish negotiating team, that these sanctions have been helpful in getting the Turks to agree to the ceasefire." And I believe the resolution that we passed helped get Turkey to the ceasefire as well. And finally, I want to thank our partners in the Syrian Democratic Forces for their ongoing dedication to countering ISIS. And I want to say to the SDF from the nation's capital on the House floor that the American people are grateful for everything you've done for us, for everything you've worked for, and everything you've sacrificed to keep the world safer. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I urge all members to support this important legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume for the purpose of closing.
The gentleman is recognized.
I'd like to again thank Ranking Member McCall for his partnership in writing this important bipartisan bill. And it's even more than just partnership. It's working together on both sides of the aisle to do good for the American people. And that's really what this should be all about, particularly when we're talking about foreign affairs. So I want to thank Mr. McCall for working closely with me and for really making this a real collaborative bill. The measure before us represents what the Foreign Affairs Committee does best: bipartisan, common sense legislation that advances American interests and American values on the global stage. The PACT Act holds Turkey accountable for its bloodshed in Syria. It calls on Erdogan to immediately stop his campaign of ethnic cleansing, to expel Syrian Kurds and other minority groups from their homeland, and to start living up to the democratic values that we expect from a NATO ally, values that right now are under constant attack in Turkey. It's a sad coincidence, Mr. Speaker. Today is the 96th anniversary of the founding of the Republic of Turkey. For nearly a century, the Turkish people have fought hard to grow and preserve democracy in their country, and Erdogan has done such incredible damage to that legacy. I call on all my colleagues to join me and Mr. McCall in supporting this legislation and sending a strong message that the United States Congress will not condone Turkey's horrific atrocities against the Kurds. Not only will we not condone it, we oppose it, we will speak out about it, and we will try in every way we can to stop it. Thank you. I yield. I urge my colleagues to support this very important measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill 4695 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative.
Speaker, on that I ask for the yeas and nays.
The gentleman from New York is recognized. The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of the Rule 20, further proceedings in this question will be postponed. Does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1623 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1623, a bill to amend the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 to provide for the treatment of payments for child care and other personal use services as an authorized campaign expenditure and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Ms. Lofgren, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the measure under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume. I rise in support of H.R. 1623. This measure is important. The Help America Run Act will amend the Federal Election Campaign Act with common sense reforms to help everyday Americans run for office. Current law does not directly address whether people who choose to run for office can use their campaign funds to cover the cost of child care. This has led several individuals to have to appeal to the Federal Election Commission for evaluations on a case-by-case basis and creates a burden for candidates with school-aged children. This bill addresses that barrier and other family-related barriers for candidates who have experiences like most everyday Americans. The Help America Run Act makes running for office easier for working mothers and fathers who need sitters for their small kids. It would support established professionals caring for an aging parent and help cover children's health insurance on the campaign trail. I know it would help moms like Katie Porter, the sponsor of this bill. She is championing this cause today as the very first single mother of young children ever to serve in the U.S. Congress. These Americans caring for their kids and their parents intimately know the dread of opening those envelopes full of prescription drug bills. They know what it's like to weigh the risk of running for office to serve the nation against the risk of losing their children's health insurance coverage. It's precisely those everyday Americans that I want to see join us at the decision-making table. Those who have firsthand knowledge of what it means to have stable child care, good schools, and secure health care are exactly the people I want making decisions on both sides of this aisle. It makes our country profoundly more rich to have those with a diversity of economic experiences in these chambers. I know that firsthand. As the daughter of a truck driver and a cafeteria cook, I worked on the night shift at the Eastman Kodak plant in Palo Alto to get ready for college. Those experiences shaped me into the person and member I am today, and I believe coming from a family like mine shouldn't disqualify you. In fact, it makes you a better policymaker who understands what her constituents are really facing. The fact is that diversity of experience leads to better policy. In 2019, the New York Times reported that fewer than 5% of representatives cite blue-collar or service jobs in their biographies. A 2015 survey by the Center for Responsive Politics showed that the median net worth for lawmakers was just over $1 million in 2013, or 18 times the wealth of the typical American household. One could see how Americans feel Congress might be out of touch. This bill is a step to building trust in Congress as by and for the people. The bill would help advance economic diversity and other types of diversity too. Even with the record number of women serving in the 116th Congress, only 1 in 4 Congresspeople are women. This isn't because women don't want to run. The Center for American Women and Politics found that 1/3 of women legislators surveyed had been actively discouraged from running for office, often by political professionals. This type of discouragement, combined with existing prohibitions on using campaign funds for domestic needs like child care, burdens that still fall disproportionately on American women, particularly disadvantages working parents. Running for office should not be limited to the wealthy or those who have no familiar responsibilities. That's anathema to the Democratic experiment, and it makes for bad policy. This bill is a simple, cost-free, common sense measure to make America's representatives look more like everyday Americans we are here to represent. For that reason, I'm proud to support it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, too, rise in support of H.R. 1623, the Help America Run Act, a bill drafted by my colleague across the aisle, newly elected Congresswoman from the great state of California, Ms. Katie Porter. I want to commend Ms. Porter for this important legislation that I believe will allow, as Chairperson Lofgren said, more people of all socioeconomic strata to be able to run for office. Strong candidates should not be limited by their circumstances to the point that it prevents them from representing their communities in Congress. Representatives of this body should and do come from all backgrounds to allow for equal representation of all who make up this institution in this great nation. I believe this bill will make that happen by allowing a candidate who's not currently a member of Congress to pay for specific necessary services like child care and dependent care that will enable a congressional candidate to participate in all campaign-connected activities. I mean, this is a decision between the candidates and the donors that give to their campaign. All we're asking to do with this piece of legislation is to allow candidates to publicly disclose child care expenses on their FEC reports. Everyone's going to know what they paid. Everybody's going to know what it went for. And that's an issue they can discuss with the people who are funding their campaigns. What this bill does not do, let me repeat, Mr. Speaker, what this bill does not do is put more money in the pockets of current members of Congress. Instead, it allows for an equal opportunity for new representation, providing more Americans who aspire to represent their communities in Congress the chance to do just that. This is not a radical idea. We should absolutely want to give everyone an equal opportunity to run, to be able to serve, if elected, in this great institution, including single parents who want to run for federal office but cannot afford the necessary child care for the grueling campaign schedules that everyone in this institution knows exists. Again, I want to thank Congresswoman Porter for her hard work on this legislation. I look forward to seeing it implemented, and I will at this time reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I am honored to yield 3 minutes to the author of this bill, my colleague from the state of California, the gentlewoman, Ms. Porter.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I'm a single mom, and when I ran for Congress last year, I spent thousands and thousands of dollars on childcare. Running for federal office requires 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100-hour work weeks. And I work nearly every single day, including every single weekend. And I also work challenging hours, often starting at 5:30 a.m. and ending with campaign events stretching late into the evening. I juggled more than a dozen childcare providers for nearly 2 years, without whom I would have never made it to Congress. I had 3 children. When I started my campaign, Betsy was 6, Paul was 9, and Luke was 11. Leaving them alone was not an option, and bringing them on the campaign trail was impossible or inappropriate. For the past 2 centuries, Congress has written many, many laws about what women may or may not do. But until this year, women's representation in Congress was less than 20%. With the election of the historic class of 2018, we hit 23.4%, 102 women, and that number is still egregiously low. There are even fewer moms in Congress, and even fewer moms of young kids, and even fewer single moms of young kids, as in just me. A major barrier to women running for elected office is their inability to afford the amount or type of childcare needed in a campaign. And that's why I introduced the Help America Run Act, which will explicitly allow candidates for federal office to use campaign contributions to pay for childcare, as well as other types of dependent care, such as elder care. Right now, candidates can use campaign funds for a whole gamut of expenses, from pizza for exhausted staff to cybersecurity for digital devices. But the law does not make it clear that childcare is among those allowed expenses. Like so many laws, there is an assumption of a female caregiver behind every male elected official. And in part because of that, moms continue to shoulder the majority of childcare responsibilities, also struggle to run for Congress. And until women are fully and equally present in Congress, women's perspectives will continue to be underrepresented. The result is a weaker democracy for the people. I'm proud that this bill previously passed the House as part of H.R. 1, the For the People Act, and now with the support of my congressional colleagues on both sides of the aisle, the House is taking this additional step to support women in